Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Jakub Niechciał. I'm senior tech leader at NetGuru. I started in web like 5 years ago from WordPress, small sites, and PHP. Then I moved to Ruby on Rails at NetGuru, where I'm for the last 3 years. Then I switched to Ember for like 2 years and React. And right now I'm more focused on leadership rather than coding, but still I assume I'm a developer. So privately I'm from Poznań, and that's how I spent last 4 hours trying to get here by car. I'm also recently married and big fan of Ember.js. So today I will try to tell you about progressive web apps, and it's pretty extensive topic. So I will try to structure my presentation first trying to say about the past and the future of the web, then about the native in mobile and its problems. Then I will have a very general overview of what are progressive web apps, what are their features, and what are the obstacles and the way forward from progressive web apps. So the first question is, how did the web of yesterday move to the web of today? Because we've started from HTML and CSS, then we had JavaScript, of course. Right now we can use index databases in our browsers. We can use geolocalization, something that was not long time ago limited to high-end smartphones, actually. We have video, we have cameras, we have microphones, we have service workers, and so on and so on. And all these features are definitely a huge step forward. And these are definitely great features, but with great power, and as we know, with great power comes great responsibility. Because for a very long time, actually, nobody was very concerned by the fact that web in mobile is pretty different from web in desktop, and not only in the size of the screen. So when the first iPhone came out, I don't know how many years ago, it exposed native features only to native applications. So it was totally acceptable that all we could think of was basically take the desktop application and minimize it on a small screen of iPhone. And when I was working as WordPress developer these 5 years ago, it was actually one of the most common requests from our customers to make my site responsive, right? But all we were doing was basically taking a grid and rolling it into one column, because nobody was better and nobody was actually going further with this. And moreover, the internet broadband and the hardware of the internet is growing pretty fast, because we had GPRS not a long time ago, we had 3G, we have 4G now, 5G is on its way. We can switch on the TV and see the ads that claim that we can have access to 100 megabits or more actually anywhere we are. And it's pretty good, but it's actually misleading, because it makes us feel that the internet is basically everywhere around us and we don't have to worry about anything. And it's of course not true, because, for example, actually the 4G user is not a 4G user most of the time. And as an example, humans have not solved the problem of lacking internet in London Underground, which is not far away from here. And the truth is that there are billions of people that don't have as fast internet as we do. They don't have as good smartphones as we do. And it's pretty hard to think about them, to think about these rural regions, distance thousands of kilometers from here. But if you build a global applications, you need to reach global users. So to sum up this short intro, we now know that web is giving us more and more native APIs, but we brought the legacy of desktop to mobile. And despite the fact that this broadband is growing, most of the time we are not actually, I don't mean we, but the humanity is not actually a 4G user. So how about native apps? Because maybe we already solved these problems and we can just drop the web on mobile and don't bother with it at all. Well, the truth is that we need to do mobile on web, web on mobile, because the hardest problem, or one of the hardest problems in software development, is the distribution. And the distribution of native application is super hard. It's very expensive. It's the user acquisition cost of native application is much more expensive, actually 5 times expensive in average than user acquisition cost of a user on the web. And the native industry is actually a winner takes it all industry. You either win or you lose. For example, 80% of time spent on mobile is spent on 3 most used applications. And we all know that supposedly our application won't be amongst these 3, right? Because we have Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and so on, and it's already 5 or 4. And the other thing is that 66% of Americans install 0 apps every month, which means that it's pretty not a lot. And I think that you are all aware of it, but let's see an example, because native applications are super massive. And what would you say if you enter the web app, the online page on a mobile, and it has 200 megabytes of JavaScript? It won't be good, right? But nobody is concerned by the fact that when we download a native application, it takes 200 megabytes and it's fine, right? So let's say that we are heading to a meetup in Berlin, which is a city abroad, of course, from here. And we want to check the location of this meetup because we forget it. And we are in Berlin already, so we need to switch on roaming. And we have 2 possibilities. First, we can download the native application of meetup.com and check it out there. Or we can use web. So let's first use native. We are looking for meetup.com on App Store. We are actually downloading 85 megabytes of data, I think, which is pretty expensive when you're using roaming. It's installed, so we are opening it. We need to sign in, it's natural. We'll use Facebook to make it faster. It was a web view actually, so it's native with web. We are almost there because we have a meetup already and we have a location of this meetup. But we spent around 100 zloty for this short mission, for this 80 megabytes of data. So this is how it may look on web. We basically enter meetup.com and we are already there, right? And it's like 1.5 or 2 megabytes. And the use case gives us everything that we have in native. We get the location 5 times faster and with only 1 or 2 megabytes. So we know that native APIs in web are here to stay. The connectivity is still the most important issue. And we know that billions of people have worse internet than we do, worse smartphones than we do, and native mobile distribution is super hard. So what are possible solutions? Progressive web apps. And what are progressive web apps? And the first thing is that it's not actually a particular technology, it's rather a concept. So I won't show you a golden snippet of code that you can copy paste and eventually your site is progressive web app in a moment. It's not a technology, it's not a particular line of code, it's rather a concept, it's a shift in how you design your page, how you test it, and how you build it from the very beginning. And the promise of progressive web apps is to deliver the value of your web app for your user from the very first moment when he or she enters your app. It doesn't matter if he is in Africa, Europe, if he or she has 4G, 3G, 2G. What matters is that despite the fact what smartphone he or she uses, we need to deliver him what he is looking for on our page. And as we all know, each web page from tens of years starts with the HTML. And HTML is something that can deliver the value from the very first moment, because no matter what smartphone our user is using, definitely HTML is there. If it's not, then probably he is not using browser, right? So each next layer, a CSS, a JavaScript, it can be geolocalization, push notifications, and more native features are actually only a progressive enhancement. So these are the layers that might or might not be accessible on your user, and your app from the very beginning, from the very HTML layer, should deliver the value that is crucial for your web. And the same as on native applications, when we have, for example, iOS, or let's stay with iOS. When we have an iOS, the app should, for example, support 3D touch on iPhone 6s, but it should also work on iPhone 5, right? So this is the 3D touch is kind of progressive enhancement. And in this case, if we understand the progressive web apps in the same trend as native applications, we can say that browser is actually our new operating system that exposes native APIs, and they might or might not be present. And the three pillars of progressive web apps is to basically bring the web to the whole world, because it's not only Europe, not only US, Canada, or New Zealand. It's also, Kenya, Sudan, and other African, Asian countries, or South American. And the three pillars are to, first of all, be reliable, be fast, and be engaging. So, what are the features of progressive web apps, and how these features address these three pillars and the promise to deliver the value? Well, the first thing is mobile and tablet design. And I think that a couple of you at least is wondering, like, what the hell are you talking about? Yes, because responsive web design is here for 5-10 years. So how responsive web design might be a core feature of progressive web apps, which is quite new. And actually, I think that mobile and tablet design is the most important feature of progressive web apps, because responsive web design is not only about the screen size. The first thing definitely is a screen size. We have a small smartphone, so we need to make sure that the web page is available and usable on this small screen of smartphone. But the second thing is UX, because we are no longer using keyboard, we are no longer using mouse, we are using gestures and our fingers. But it's also very well covered, I think, in most responsive web design use cases. But the third thing is very often forgotten, and it's a context, because our user is no longer ahead of a 27-inch desktop machine, but probably he or she is driving, and even though it's illegal, he's driving and only taking a glimpse every 3-5 seconds on your smartphone, on his or her smartphone, and he needs to get the value what he's looking for. And if we don't want to think about illegal driving and using smartphone, we can think about being on a bus, on a tram, in an underground where there are a lot of people, a lot of traffic around, a lot of distraction, and he or she still needs to use our application and stay focused in this distractious environment. So mobile and tablet design is the first core feature of progressive web apps. The second thing is add to home screen, and add to home screen is pretty straightforward. Add to home screen allows our user to add the icon, a shortcut, to our web page, to home screen of our user smartphone. And basically insert our shortcut next to native applications. The implementation is very straightforward. It's based on meta tags, basically. All you have to do is provide a name for the application in meta tag and the icon. And it's working on all major platforms. And the demo is basically entering meetup.com, clicking share, clicking add to home screen. You can change the name. We switch off the browser at all, and we use a shortcut from our home screen. So this is an example how we can add meetup.com that is actually not very often used, I think. Application to be quickly reachable from your home screen. The second thing is custom splash screen. And custom splash screen is a thing that appears in this brief moment after you click the icon on the home screen and the moment when your web page is actually loaded. And in this case, in this demo, it was widescreen basically. There was nothing there. And the implementation is also pretty straightforward because it is based on meta tags on iOS and on manifest file on Android. But it is supposedly working on both of these, but I wasn't able to actually run it on iOS. So I was doing everything according to documentation and it didn't work. So I made the demo on Android. You have a demo application on home screen. It's called PWA by NetGuru. And if you open it, this is a custom splash screen. So instead of a white blank screen, you have something that engages your users. It's not engaging in terms of being funny or something like this. It's basically something else than a white screen. So the user feels that something is basically happening. So we're getting to the hottest feature in web for ages, being offline first. So what does it actually mean to be offline first? The first thing is that when we think about being offline first, we need to make a strong claim that being online is only a progressive enhancement. It is one of the layers that may or may not be accessible. But offline first does not actually mean that we are supporting no connection at all. It means that we can't give the users with less connectivity worse experience than those with no connectivity at all. So offline first means that we are basically using cache everywhere we can, first returning cached response and then trying to make the request. And in this case, our I have no internet user will have the same experience as our 2G user, which will wait for this request for 10 seconds, but eventually he or she will get it. So how can we achieve being offline first, right? But first, before, there is no internet connection page from home, and this is the example of your operating system error. If you made this claim and you believe that your browser is basically an operating system, this is something that we should avoid as much as we can. This is something like your iPhone basically restarted by using your application, or it basically crashed and switched off. So again, how you can achieve the being offline first? By, of course, using service workers. And service workers are basically a separate thread that is executing in even after our user leaves the page. The service worker does not have any connection to the page that either instantiated it or is currently being viewed. All the communication between the page that instantiated the service worker and the service worker itself is based on events and event handlers in both ways. And the life cycle of service worker is based on pipeline, not an API. So all we can do is basically add event listeners, but not execute any commands on our service worker. And we have 3 stages of this life cycle. It's register, install, and activate. And the rest of the time, the service worker is either staying idle or handling the events that came from the web page that instantiated this service worker. So let's dive into these stages and see what's going on there. The first thing is register, and the register step is very easy. It's a pretty short JavaScript snippet that is executed in your index.html file. All it do is basically pointing out where the service worker file is, and in this case it is sw.js. So we are using the if statement to see if the service worker is present in the browser, and if it is, we execute register with the file path. The install step is where the service worker is being instantiated, and we have the chance to define what we actually want to cache in the service worker and how, of course. And in this case, we are basically defining that we want to cache all the assets and the index.html file, and we add it to cache under the cache name mysitecache version 1. So the cache, first of all, can be versioned, and second of all, we can either add assets or even the full API requests even to all the external services, not only ours. And activate step is the last step before the service worker is actually being used. So activate is the step where we can get rid of old cache or reuse it if necessary, but that's why we don't get rid of the old cache in install step, because the service worker might get installed but not activated, because there is, for example, an old instance of service worker still working. And activate is the last step before the service is actually being used. So for example, right here, all we do is cleaning, deleting the cache. And the rest of the time after the installation, the service worker is either staying idle or is actually handling the events from the web page that instantiated it. And what is the most common use case for this event? Of course, fetch event, because this is how we can make the page offline first. We are intercepting fetch events or handling fetch events with event argument. This argument has a request instance. We can, for example, check the cache for this particular request. If we have a cache, we can return the cache. If we don't have, we are basically making the request and then cache the response again. This example is not pretty good because it does not try to make the request if we have it in cache. But in the ideal world, you should always make a request after getting it from cache to have the newest data available. And for example, Washington Post application the Washington Post mobile web app is, for example, caching all the news that you have read. And thus, when you are, for example, walking through London and reading Washington Post news, you can get into Underground and still read them and even change them and move back, move forth to the ones that you have already seen. And it's all based on service workers. So service workers are basically proxying the internet for us. They are entering between the mobile web app and the internet, and they can intercept every request and make the response or get the response from the internet or from cache. And this is why we need to make sure that we are using SSL, because we need to make sure that there is no option for middlemen in our service worker, what will mean that the middleman can imitate the response how it wants, what is not acceptable, right? And the short demo, again on Android, because service workers are supported only in Chrome Android, Chrome Web, and Firefox, and they are not supported in Safari at all. So that's why I'm doing it on Android. So I've built a demo application that uses service worker. We can visit it, we can change the sub page. And now we can switch off the airplane mode, which will actually disable Wi-Fi and mobile and so on, and refresh the page. And as you see, it's still there. We can even change the sub page and again refresh, and it's all here. So we have no internet, no mobile, no Wi-Fi, and we are still using the web app. Another hot feature, push notifications. Push notifications, I'm discussing push notifications after service workers because they are actually using service worker under the hood. And push notifications are something that was for a very long time limited to native smartphones, right? But right now we can reach out to our user, engage them, and notify them via a very native experience of push notifications on Android devices, of course. So push notifications engage our users, but the implementation of push notifications is actually pretty complex because they are supported on a couple of platforms. First, it's Chrome desktop, it's Chrome Android, it's Safari desktop, but not Safari iOS, and I think Firefox, but I'm not sure. And each of these implementation is different. So to not reinvent the wheel, it's the best idea to actually use some ready-to-use software as a service solution, like OneSignal, for example, which is free, unlimited. And the demo is pretty simple. We click the send button, which will make OneSignal push notification to this smartphone. And as you can see, this push notification is truly native. It's the same experience as on native Android application. And next feature is not a feature, it's rather a characteristic to actually try to make your progressive web app as fast as possible. And I don't want to give you any numbers, I hate benchmarks. And it's really hard to say if your particular page is rendering in 1 second, oh, is it good or not? In 5 seconds, is it good or not? I don't know actually. What I mean here is that we should make our app, we should try to make our web app not take longer to render than native application. And I know it's actually impossible or very, very hard, but this is something we can follow basically. Don't follow the 10 seconds, don't follow 5 seconds from Google. Just try to make it as fast as possible to make it as to make the best experience for your user as possible. And the last thing from the features is all the web things. You know, so first thing, we have no platform owner review process, right? So we have a very native feel application in web that we can basically deploy in seconds, right? And we don't have to worry about the provider at all. We basically deploy and it's all there available to everyone, everywhere on the world, of course, if he or she has an internet connection, right? So that's why the web has the fastest release cycle possible comparing to native, of course. So these were the features and my claim getting to the end of the presentation is that progressive web apps are actually the future of the web. And I really mean it because try to imagine the possibilities in next few years and we are still very, I think, for example, I am very focused on Europe, on Poland, or on Germany, UK, whatever. I think every day I think that the internet is everywhere and the Europe is the center of the world. It's not. Actually, there are billions of people that are using 2G and in next 5 years there will be billions more, maybe not billions, but millions more. So definitely progressive web apps are the future of the web because software is developing very fast and the hardware is not as fast. And definitely it won't develop as fast in these Asian or Africa countries. So we'll have the web of tomorrow with today's hardware. And quoting one of my most liked thought leaders, Tom Dale, who is a senior staff software engineer at LinkedIn, the cost of code is too damn high. And what I mean here is that the progressive web apps won't be adopted they won't be adopted widely if the development of the progressive web app will take 2 or 3 times longer than just regular application. So this is the problem. There is a lot of code to write to become a true progressive web application. The next thing is that we don't have a lot opinionated solutions about debugging, about analytics or being offline, about testing, and so on. There are like Google Analytics. I know it's very opinionated, right? But is it tested on progressive web apps? I don't know. Basically, we still don't have a lot of opinionated claims about progressive web apps. Browser support still vary. And I know that I've already said that basically this deliver the value from the very first moment, no matter what the browser is, claim is very strong. But it's a gift for our users, but a real curse for developers, because the fact that the browser supports still is very much vary, it takes a lot of time to basically make it work on all of them. However, we have a very rapid pace of open source development. So for example, Ember is splitting a lot of its code base to smaller packages that can be reused for progressive web apps. React Create App is creating a boilerplate of progressive web app from the very beginning by default. The same does Vue. So there is still a lot to do in this open source community about progressive web apps, but we have a very rapid pace of this development. And the last thing is that progressive web apps are actually a journey, because you can't basically make sure in one snippet of code that you have already done the progressive web app homework, right? It's a journey, it's a shift in how we develop application, it's a shift in how we test them, it's a shift in how we design them, and this is something that might be overwhelming, but if we take basically a baby steps approach, it's pretty fun. So thanks. That's all. And the questions, of course.
Okay, there's one. Okay.
So let's say you'd like to create a progressive web app. Do you have to think about it since the first day, or you can, create the web app and then add some features that will make it progressive?
Yeah, I would definitely think about it from the very first moment, because it will make it the easiest way. And if you don't think about it from the very first moment, and you are using, for example, Ember or React or whatever else that has server-side rendering, but you don't use it because you don't need to, because you're not building PWA, right? And you use jQuery and you use a lot of DOM and so on, it will be very hard to eventually migrate to server-side rendering, right? Where there is no DOM and no jQuery. And on the other hand, it's very common approach for big brands to not make the whole page, the whole web app, progressive web app, but only a part of it that is crucial for the user. For example, Flipkart, the Indian eBay, we can say, at the very beginning made a PWA from its search, then from its checkout page, and so on. Twitter actually is pretty small application, so they rewrote it from the very beginning. They basically dropped the desktop and wrote mobile from the very beginning from scratch to make it PWA. So I think it's very hard to actually answer this question. It all depends on your use case. But if you are building it for yourself, or you want to eventually, you are pretty sure that you will eventually make it a PWA, I would start from the very beginning.
And the second question, do you think it's more expensive to create progressive web app comparing to native app?
I don't know actually, because it all depends on the use case. Progressive web apps are exposing a lot of native APIs, but not all. So it all depends on the use case you have. First thing is that maybe it's not possible to build a PWA for a use case. But on the other hand, if it is possible, and even if it will take more money to build a progressive web app, maybe it's worth it, because your user might basically not install your native application, right? So why did you build this? So as long as you are pretty sure that your user will actually install the application in mass market and so on, then it makes sense. But in case, for example, I hate such things like TripAdvisor. I'm not installing TripAdvisor native application because I'm not tripping every day, right? But when I trip, I want to have access to it immediately, so I use the web app. So it all depends on the use case.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, I have a question about future of progressive web apps, because I'm not up to date with news on the inside this environment, and I have the question: how about supporting progressive web apps by a WebKit engine?
You mean? You are answering this question because of the Apple, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
My opinion is that Apple does not want to support progressive web apps because it's not good for them, right? They have App Store. So they are making billions of dollars from App Store, from the fact that native developers are paying $500, or I don't know how much is it right now, to have license to write native application, and then that there is a huge job market for native developers, and that by the fact that it costs to basically deploy the application, and eventually they have 30% from your purchases, right? So they want people to write native applications, and that's why they don't support progressive web apps right now. I mean, it's my opinion. I think that that's why they don't support progressive web apps right now. But the trend is obvious. And if they want the users to basically have these features, they will need to eventually move to implement them in Safari. But on the other hand, how many people are using iPhones in Africa or Asia? So maybe it's not even the strategy for basically, I mean, it's not worth not only because the App Store, but also that people won't use it at all, because in Europe, in United States, we have pretty good internet. We have iPhones, which are absolutely amazing devices, right? So they are not, progressive web apps are not marketed for iPhone users, basically.
From what I understood, okay, sorry, developing progressive web apps is a lot like developing resilient software, software which can cope with failure, which can cope with hostile environment, and it's very expensive to develop such software. So the question becomes, how can you practically make developing progressive web apps sexy to make this cost more palatable, yeah, more acceptable?
Mm-hmm.
Because not everyone is Wall Street Journal that has to work in the London Tube, which has to have eyeballs, but we need to progress the technology.
Yeah, so if your targeted users are from big cities in Europe, it's not worth to build progressive web app. Basically, that's the case. If you're looking for business perspective, it's not worth to spend more money only to basically give features that won't be used at all. So, but on the other hand, if you are building a global application, you must think about this. For example, LinkedIn for a long time has, I think that most of us are using LinkedIn and have seen that they changed the design in last year pretty much. And this was somehow driven by the fact that they have seen that they are not reaching all the possible users they can. They have filled every possible CV in US and Europe, but there were still 3 billion people that do not have the account on LinkedIn in Central Asia and Central Africa. So that's why they focused on making the site more progressive. And if you don't have this use case and you don't need to do it, then it's basically wasting your money.
But also, for example, you're talking that the market should be only third-party countries, but it's not true. Let's look on Uber. They created progressive web app because they want to even not spend this traffic for users. Their native app is like for 40 megabytes, and progressive web app is really 2-3 megabytes.
Yeah,
So, and they are not pointing to.
I didn't mean that this is the only true opinion that I just claimed. In my opinion, this was the question about spending a lot of additional money to fulfill all the Lighthouse, Google benchmark, all the 100 checkpoints, and make your progressive web app 100%. But there are a lot of features that can be very easily implemented and might basically give a good UX to your users, even in Poland or Europe. I'm personally using mobile Twitter, not Twitter application, because I have a poor 16 gigabytes iPhone, and I want to save storage, and the Twitter application is 250 megabytes, and the Twitter progressive web app is 1 megabyte of JavaScript and gives basically the same UX, the same feeling.
Hello. Correct me if I'm wrong. What's so expensive in making progressive web app? If you just write the application once instead of 3 versions, like the web and 2 native ones. And for me, it looks like the only thing you need is the data layer, which is persistent on the client. So it just can, when you reconnect, it just merge with the original state. And then you just use these 2 features of the icon on your mobile and the notifications, and that's progressive web app. So what's so hard in it?
Well, the first thing is that it's not only writing this code, right? You need to test it, for example. You need to test it on multiple devices, on multiple users. You have to test it on 2G, 3G. If it works, you make sure, just to make sure that it works. So the first thing is that testing takes a lot more money. The second thing is that if we are using good open source, which is on a very good way to be there, then it should be seamless. Like, as you say, you basically install, I don't know, Redux offline. I think that there exists such package. You install Redux offline and it works, right? It should look like, and it will eventually look like this in a year, maybe a half year. But in recent 1-2 years, it was actually pretty hard because most of these things you would need to write yourself.
Okay, so I can agree with this, that it needs to looks well on each device, but we have it still like with responsive layout. And with this 2G, 3G, there is no difference because of this layer. If you have a layer which is fine offline, then it works if you don't have internet or it's not so good.
Yeah, so I think that there is no good answer for your question, and I feel that it's okay for me to admit that it's not very expensive unless it basically becomes expensive and you have not expected it, right? So as long as everything works out and it all feels good and you are using open source that works with one npm install or yarn install, it's all okay. But if it breaks and you don't know why, that's when things get expensive.
Okay, so thank you, Jakub, for your presentation.
Thanks.